The Yolo County RCD, we are sponsoring this talk. It is part of the CDFA's Healthy Soils Program demonstration project. We're doing a demonstration project at Yolo Land and Cattle right now. We're testing out healthy soils practices, and there are many for ranches that we're interested in and learning more about. The project itself is compost, so we're not going to see that today, but I did bring the latest research, the researcher's report, and I'll put that out if you want to grab that. Basically, we're doing a 3-year compost trial way out in the back here to look and see what happens what happens to soil when we do put on this light layer of compost. And so far, what we're seeing is increased water infiltration, which is pretty exciting, and some increases in soil microbes and things in the soil profile. But we will find out what happens with greenhouse gas emissions. That's also being tested. But so when we're thinking about healthy soils, we're thinking about climate smart practices that could be incorporated on rangeland that also helps benefit ag operations. Also, one of the first things we do think about is prescribed burning, something in Yolo County that we wish we could do more of. And it is a healthy soils practice in the sense that it improves rangeland. It actually fuels management, as you can imagine, doing good fuels management also reduces greenhouse gas emissions over time because it prevents those catastrophic wildfire events where everything goes up in smoke. So I met Phil Dye at the Northwest Wildfire Resiliency Gathering in Molalla. Jeanette Rosinski from the RCD and I went to that this winter after the county fire was kind of a wake-up call here, and fire department started talking to the Office of Emergency Services, started talking to a group in Winters that's putting together a community wildfire protection plan. So we're trying to help with programming, better fuels management, wildfire prevention, and we're kind of making progress, and part of that is learning. So we invited Phil, we're really lucky to have him. He was part of the previous program with a compost project in July, but wasn't able to attend. So actually this is really nice to be able to focus on this topic and here spend a little time. Phil's a burn boss, which is the coolest job title I have ever heard of. And he's a private consultant for Prometheus Fire Consulting, and he has worked for decades on this topic. So I will stop talking and turn it over to him. I also wanted to point out that, Scott, do you want to say something real quick about, what your interests are on all of these things, healthy soils, prescribed burning, everything that you've been working on for 30 plus years out here?
Introduce, like some people might not have maybe not been up to the ranch before, so a little background about what you do up here.
This is Scott Stone, the owner of the ranch. I apologize. Come on.
Welcome to the Yolo Land and Cattle. My brother Casey over on the far side, and our partners here, and Chris Flynn in the back corner is our ranch foreman. This ranch is 7,500 acres, goes from 300-foot elevation up to about 2,300-foot elevation, and kind of all different types of vegetation we have here on the ranch. And so last year the fire that we had last year, this is a working cow-calf operation. Last year the fire that we had, and it was the first fire in 30 years on this ranch. We actually had 3 fires. We haven't had any fires for 30 years. A small one in June. We had the big one in the beginning of July, and then we had the smaller one about 2 weeks after. So 7,500 acres, 7,000 acres burned. We've been trying to get some burning done for many, many years, which has been possible in California anymore. We do prescribe burns. I try to reduce the fuel loads, but we got it done last year. Anyway, we're just trying to make a living out here on the land and try to do a better job with it. It's pretty frustrating that trying to get stuff done in California. I'm not going to do on that soapbox today, but we would like to, these lands, they've evolved through eons of having fires as a tool in the toolbox. It'd be nice to put that back into the toolbox to be able to actually use it here in California. And so we did it. We're looking forward to working with CAL FIRE and a bunch of different folks, Phil too, and trying to get some programs going. We have some pretty good partners on some of the projects that we've been doing over the years. But I think finally the ball started to get moved in the right direction. People realizing that we have to manage these lands and try to do the best job we can to manage them. I think part of that's including the fire regime. So we did do a VMP about probably 10 or 12 years ago. That was a dismal failure. But I think attitudes have changed, hopefully in the state government, in a lot of these bureaucracies where we can finally start getting some really good things done because it needs to be done. So again, welcome to the old Cal. Answer whatever questions that we can if we need to.
Thank you, Scott. Well, good morning, everyone. And for those of you who are standing, yes, please come find a seat. I only kept that seat occupied because, do you want to sit there? Sure. Okay. Because I may need to go back there and switch between programs. As Heather said, my name is Phil Dye. I'm with Prometheus Fire Consulting, and I want to start with an apology for those of you who were out here in June who were expecting to hear me speak along with the other speakers. I was unable to make it, and it was just a very, very busy time of year for me, and so I was unable to make it. But I'm very grateful to Heather and the rest of the YOLO RCD staff for affording me this opportunity to come out today to talk to you about a subject that obviously I care very deeply about, which is prescribed fire, and particularly prescribed fire for private landowners. As Heather and particularly Scott mentioned, we all know that California has a fire problem, and a big part of that fire problem is not only are we getting the wrong kinds of fire, high intensity, stand replacing, moonscaping type of fires, but we're not getting enough of the right kind of fire, the fire that has a lot of ecological benefit, renews ecosystems, the kind of fires that really made California the state it is today, the state that we love so much, all our beautiful vistas and ecosystems, in large part were a result of regular and frequent fire. So, and Scott definitely mentions a good point is for a long time, fire, prior to, let's say, 1960-ish or so, if you go back and you look at the history of fire on private lands in California, there were actually quite a few ranchers who were doing some burning. And everywhere I've gone in the state, when I talk to either the older generation or the children of the older generation, they'll tell me plenty of stories about how, oh yeah, we used to go out to Bob's ranch and, we'd burn it every spring, and then the next week we'd go over to, Mike's ranch or Barbara's ranch or whatever, and it was just kind of this informal burn association. I don't think they called it that, but there's some great pictures, great historic pictures of, just a bunch of pickup trucks and people with drip torches and going out and getting it done. due to a confluence of factors, that was slowly kind of taken away, or the interest waned. And so then we went through a period where there was very little prescribed fire being done, and what prescribed fire was being done was mostly done on agency lands, particularly federal lands in the National Forest System. But that was, a drop in the bucket. And so, fuel loads accumulated, and then on top of that we had climate change. I know you all know this, so I don't want to repeat what you already know, but essentially we've arrived at this point today now where we have, heavily vegetated ecosystems that have had fire excluded from them for a long, long, long time, and it's time to put fire back in the landscape. The good news is it's like turning around a battleship. It takes miles to turn a battleship around, and I think I'm starting to see that battleship turn. And I know the Forest Service is committed to doing a lot more prescribed burning. CAL FIRE has been fabulous to work with these last few years. They've gone from, when I first got in this business, they've gone from, giving me a permit, but there was a lot of questions, a lot of hesitancy, to now, when I have these conversations with CAL FIRE, it's let me look at your burn plan, looks great, here's your burn plan, can we send you resources, we'll put an engine on standby for you, we'll make this happen. And so it's really inspiring to see, and like I said, I think the battleship is starting to turn around. One thing I'd like to start with, well, let me go to the next slide, tell you a little bit about my company. I've been in the California Fire Service for about 25 years now. I started out as a local government firefighter in the Bay Area, and worked there for 20 years, and then left. The main reason I left is because after 20 years of putting out fires, which was a great career, and I had a lot of fun doing it. But in the last, 8 or 10 years or so, I started thinking, we really ought to be letting some of these fires just burn. Particularly where they don't threaten infrastructure and they're in remoter parts of the state. We should probably just let them burn and let it burn to a well-established control line, and then just manage it from there. But of course, that wasn't the culture at that time. And that's kind of what inspired me to get into this. So I got into it so much that I became a prescribed fire burn boss, which is a qualification that is both recognized by the federal government as well as the state. And essentially what it is it says, we recognize your training, we recognize your experience, and you have this qualification. Not so important for you folks unless you're doing NRCS work, which I'll talk about that. I've done projects now in 8 states across the country, and my client base is pretty diverse. I work a lot with the Nature Conservancy, particularly in their TREX program, and TREX is an acronym for Training Exchange. I'll talk about that a little bit. I've worked with CAL FIRE. In fact, in the CAL FIRE unit that I live in, the Santa Clara unit, the unit forester is completely overwhelmed with work. And Miguel, you probably know this, but CAL FIRE has gone from a little bit of this prescribed fire work to all of a sudden it's like here's a giant workload. And so trying to manage it all has been really challenging for them. So they've asked me to step in and help them. So that's been really exciting. And then there's a couple other clients that I've burned with. I've burned in the Midwest and in the Southwest. And I've also burned a lot with feds. And mostly I'm here to help you learn how to burn, and help you, get some fire back on your land. All right, before I go to this next slide, I want to circle back to, I know in the previous workshop you guys had here, was it here, Heather?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So one of the topics, and correct me if I'm wrong, Heather, but the topic of that workshop was about carbon sequestration and
reducing greenhouse gas emissions and how urban landscapes like rangeland benefit climate change.
Okay, thank you. So I found this paper. I've actually had it for a while, but then I thought of it while I was thinking of this presentation. And here was a really interesting paper, I thought, is for years we always think of forests as our carbon sinks, you know, places that retain carbon. But it's actually, there's some research coming out now that maybe we ought to throw grasslands into the mix too. And so I won't read this to you, but essentially what this paper says is, due to climate change, due to high intensity fires, which are now you know, burning the trees as well as the understory, forests now have either already or on target to become net carbon emitters, not carbon sinks. And so that poses obviously some serious problems for us on this planet. And so these authors say maybe we ought to start looking at grasslands as a carbon sink, and maybe they're a little more reliable, mostly because they store a lot of their carbon below ground. And the other thing is that when your grassland burns, it comes right back the following year, you know, maybe 2 years later. Whereas when a forest burns, it takes many, many, many years for it to come back. So I thought that was really kind of an interesting paper, and if you're interested in that, let me know, or let Heather know, and I can certainly send you that paper. Oh, and by the way, during my presentation, if you have a question or a comment, you know, feel free to interrupt. This is hopefully a little bit of dialogue here, so please let me know if you have questions.
Would it be helpful for you to get a good whirlwind introduction to who you're talking to, or?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was actually going to do that, and then right out of my mouth. Yeah, if you could maybe, if we could just go around the room for a few minutes and tell me your name and who you're affiliated with, and if it's not obvious why you're here, then tell me why you're here. So.
Okay, my name is Kitty. I'm with the Xerces Society, which is an invertebrate conservation org, and we work a lot with farmers and ranchers, and that benefit from being able to help them great.
Okay, thank you.
Jessica Cruz, also with the Xerces Society. We're both based out of Sacramento, and yeah, the work that we're both doing, especially on ranches, it seems like it would be really good to have some of this information. We do restoration work.
Bob Gillespie, NRCS, State Green Specialist here in California, and I work with our state forester to those responsibilities on prescribed rivers.
Chris Carlson, Salon RCD, work with landowners in a variety of projects, but I have a background in forestry and fire, so interested in learning a little bit more about that as it applies to New California.
Bruce Roman, your local farmer and range landowner, just nearby here.
Great.
Phil Logan, I'm the District Conservationist for NRCS here in Yolo County.
Scott Stone, laborer.
I'm Universe, and I'm on cat restoration assistant at
For Cache Creek.
My name is Luke Peterson. I work with Lakewood Conservation Science and NRCS Solana County. So I'm here to learn more about opportunities that are arising in California.
I'm Corey Shank. I also, same position, Point Blue and NRCS. Have worked on some prescribed fire right here in this area, some others, and hoping we can find ways to make it more efficient and get done frequently. Other landowners as well.
My name is Zach Emerson. I'm with Cat Creek Conservancy as well. I'm attending gathering botanist/manager. We've done a number of cultural burns in the garden because it's a Native American gathering garden.
Okay.
Obviously, as pretty much everybody here knows, Native Americans were the original fire practitioners in California, a huge influence for them. So we're not only trying to use cultural fire in the garden a lot more to manage the plants there, but we're also trying to get prescribed fire on the preserve as a whole a lot more. It's a 140-acre nature preserve, and we're doing active restoration. We have a number of grasslands that definitely need some fire.
Zach, are you familiar with what the Yurok and the Karuks are doing up in?
Yeah, I am actually signing up for the Yurok treks.
Oh, good. I was just going to recommend that to you, so excellent.
I'm doing it for solid interest and helping it. I love all that nature.
Bruce Gardner, I'm the open space manager for the city.
Excellent.
Barrel Room, retired fire chief in Fargo, and I work for programs in extract rooms. I'm here for the past week.
Well,
Government involvement like it used to be.
yeah. Hopefully.
Jennifer says, yeah, I'm also in university, and over the years I've been involved in a lot of programs and workshops and stuff, but it's mostly 10 clusters. So,
For as long as it's part of fire.
Thank you for being here.
Heather, I introduce myself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm Chris Flynn, I'm the branch manager, very foreman,
There you go.
Gil Watson, the local battalion chief in the area, just years, I guess,
I'm Joanne Hardy of the County Resource Conservation District, and I am here to figure out how we can improve this service and make it more efficient for landowners in the county.
Cedar, Winters, landowner, areas of gap, and also existing county, and they're involved in fire, control of life, various forms of negotiating and all that.
I'm John Hammond, neighbor to Cedar. I'm interested in the possibility of doing some control in our area. In various gaps, kind of critical place for fires coming down. We have the canyon from various, for example, drag fire. We had potential for heat just 2 days ago.
Yeah, canyon fire.
Casey Showmill and now, soft.
Gina Brady, the County Corporate Extension Office, and work with the Climate Smart Ag programs. We're letting Duke County burn a lot, so it would be nice to be a little more prepared.
Ellen Farmer from Santa Cruz County, and I've been volunteering with the Resource Conservation District trying to get some of these education programs going in our county.
Thank you for that. I was just going to say we're probably going to have to start yelling here, but yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And thank you all for your introductions. That's really helpful to me to kind of know who I'm speaking to and what you're interested in. So again, please, if you have a question or a comment during my presentation, let me know. If there's a specific question or issue you want to talk about and I don't already talk about it, please, again, let me know so I can hopefully get, well, I don't know if I can get all your questions answered, but I can at least get most of your questions answered and at least point you in the right direction. Okay, so we know the fire's been part of the California landscape for millennia. It's been part of pretty much the world's history was shaped by fire. And most of the vegetation in California is fire adapted, and much of it is, or some of it, is fire dependent. Of course, meaning that it requires fire to propagate or thrive. You know, one of the most iconic species that I think of is the Ponderosa Pine. You know, the seeds, the cones will only open up under the heat of a fire, and that's what causes the seed to spread. So, but there's many other fire-dependent species, and so our landscapes need this fire to maintain its health and maintain diversity. Other reasons, a big one, of course, of late is to reduce the risk or effects of wildfire. As I talked about earlier, you know, our landscapes have become so overgrown that now what historically might have been a low intensity, possibly moderate intensity fire, now moves across the landscape. Long flame lengths, high rates of spread, great intensity, burns everything, and then we kind of set the biological clock sort of back to, you know, 100 years. For ranchers, a big reason for burning is to improve the quality of forage for the livestock, not only in terms of the amount of forage that's available the following year, but reducing invasive species such as, and when I came in this morning, the burn boss side of my brain immediately kicked in when I passed through all that yellow star thistle, and I was like, oh, we gotta burn this. Because fire can be a very effective tool for yellow star thistle management. Other reasons for prescribed fire, again, I talked about this, reduce hazardous fuels. Hazardous fuels would be not only the density of the fuels, or we call them fuels, vegetation to most everybody else, but also the type of vegetation that contributes to rapid fire spread. Sometimes I've been called to do burning as site preparation. So for example, we might burn a site, remove the residual dry matter or the stubble that's on the ground, and then the following year someone's going to come in and plant or reseed. Improve wildlife habitat. Some of you may have already seen this, but it's very common right after a burn, sometimes actually during the burn, wildlife comes right back in, and because they love the browse, they love the fact that it's opened up. I've seen deer actually, while fire's still on the ground in another part of the burn unit where the fire's burned through or it's smoldering. I've seen deer browsing and their muzzles all black from digging around in the burned area. Manage competing vegetation. So if you want to favor one species over another, fire's a great way to do it. Control disease. Sometimes you can get rid of disease by the use of fire. One area, going back to that previous one, is there's some research that maybe sudden oak death, the incidence of sudden oak death can be mitigated. I wouldn't say prevented, but mitigated by more frequent burning. Enhance appearance. Sometimes people just want to burn because they know what it looks like when a low intensity fire has gone through. And I'm sure all of you have the experience of going through the Sierras or other places, oak woodlands, and if they have a program of regular fire, you're driving down the road, you come around the corner and it's like, wow, that looks great. So that's another reason to burn. Sometimes to improve access for a variety of different reasons, either access for livestock, access for infrastructure. Talked about this, fire adapted, fire dependent species. Manage endangered species. So some species thrive in the presence of regular low intensity fire. And so that's another reason. I think that's all. Okay. So I hear the term prescribed fire controlled burning used interchangeably, and I think for our purposes that's totally appropriate. When speaking to the general public, I often use those terms interchangeably as well, although there is actually, at least in my mind, technically a difference. Controlled burning is simply that. It's burning that's done that you hope to keep, in a box, so to speak. You may or may not be burning for a specific reason. So that therein lies, I think, the key difference. Prescribed fire, however, it's applied in a skillful manner under specific environmental conditions to achieve specific resource objectives. And I'll give you an example here in a minute about what that looks like, or certainly in a prescribed fire burn plan. Did I get that right? So let's talk a little bit about laws and regulations. And I think you mentioned about, how can we reduce the paperwork burden? I don't know if we can ever really eliminate it, but yeah, hopefully we can make it easier and more streamlined. And I think we are working toward that. All right, so if Ellen wanted to burn her land, what would she need to do? Well, she's got to get various permits and permissions. Usually it starts with a conversation with the authority, the fire agency having jurisdiction over your land. In most cases, most rural cases here in California, that's going to be CAL FIRE. So you start a conversation with the local unit or the local battalion chief and you say, hey, I'd like to burn my land, and they'll get you started down this process. Ultimately, if it's approved, they'll issue an LE7 or LE8 document, which gives you permission to burn your land. I'm going to give you an example of what that permit looks like because there's almost always conditions to that permit. You can only burn on certain days under these conditions and so on and so forth, and I'll give you an example of that. And most fire agencies, I'm sure, Miguel or Chief Watson, it's probably your policy too that before you issue that permit, you need to go out and look at someone's land and
we like to inspect it.
Yeah.
Just to see what the overall objective is and see if there's any place we can help.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Yeah, so most fire agencies are going to want to come out and take a look at your control lines. They're going to want to take a look at, where you're planning on burning. Maybe talk a little bit with you about, your project and make sure that, they understand your thinking so that you're all aligned on the same page. The permit will likely add conditions, and that's not a very good slide. Let me, thank you. Let me show you a better one here. So this was from a prescribed burn I did just last month, actually. So it starts here on this page and goes to the next page, but I'll just show you this. Let me make this a little bigger so you can read it. Okay, so some stuff here at the beginning saying, if anything escapes, please let us know. And it talks about notifications. So here is something that's very specific. Okay, so you can't burn if the 100-hour dead fuel moistures are below 8%. Does everybody understand, or would you like me to explain fuel size classes? Okay. So in the fire world, we talk about fuel size classes being 1 hour, 10 hour, 100 hour, 1,000 hour, and so on. And that's based on, the number comes from the time lag that it takes for that fuel to reach 63% of the environmental moisture. So simplest way to think about it is a 1 hour fuel is something like grass or anything smaller than a 1/4 inch in diameter. These are fuels or vegetation. They're going to gain moisture quickly, but they're going to lose moisture quickly. And we see this every spring transitioning into summer in California, right? What's the first thing that dries out? The grasses. So the grass turns around first, and then the shrubs follow, and then the larger stuff. So in this particular burn plan, the 100-hour fuel moistures are anything 1 to 3 inches. And then anything over 3 to 8 inches is 1,000 hour, and so on. So that was one of the conditions of the permit. And what else? It talks about control lines. So it requires that it's a mow strip. It doesn't specify the width. In this case, I made the mow strip 10 feet. And then, because the grass was pretty tall on this particular burn unit. And then a 16-inch scrape to bare mineral soil. What else? Talks a little bit about some patrol standards, right? And this will all be in your burn plan. And then here on the next page, and I don't know why it's dark like that, I apologize. But it says, here's your the permit conditions for your minimum staffing, as well as minimum amount of equipment, water, and hose. So that is an example of a burn permit. Okay. Any questions so far?
How many acres was that one?
That was just a very small burn. That was only 3 acres. And that actually was an interesting burn. I was hired by the University of California Cooperative Extension, who was looking to show ranchers and landowners, much like many of you, what prescribed fire could do to help their land. In this particular case, it was a yellow star thistle control project. And because it was just a demonstration project, we just picked a 3-acre parcel that was fairly heavily infested with yellow star thistle.
So would CAL FIRE, the agency that is issuing the permit, be the ones who tell you what the perimeter, like mow or scrape area needs to be for the safety of that fire? Are they the ones who recommend?
And the number of people required?
I'm sorry?
And the number of people that were required?
Yeah, and the resource. So your question is, would CAL FIRE specify that? When people hire me, because of my experience, I have a pretty good idea of what I think is an acceptable control line. And that includes both mow lines, wet lines, scrapes, or no lines at all. And let me give you a specific example of that is up on the north coast, if I'm burning in late fall, like October, oftentimes after a rain or a couple rains, it's really moist under the dug firs. but the grass lines are still dry. So my goal there is I'll just burn the grass line and push it right into the dug fir forest, because it'll go out by itself, and I don't put any lines in at all. But back to your question, so you know, a contractor will specify that. If you as a landowner have no idea where to start, then yes, absolutely, CAL FIRE can come and say, you know, this is what we recommend. It's usually a balancing act. The simplest and easiest thing to do would be, you know, put a giant scraper on the whole thing. But a lot of ranchers and landowners, you know, number one, they don't want to put that scar on the land. Number two is if invasive species are concerned, then you have to say, okay, well, I have a great control line, but now I'm opening up my land for you know, more invasives to come in. But yeah, CAL FIRE is a fabulous, or your local fire agency, a fabulous resource to start with, because they're looking at it from a standpoint, as you, the landowner, is what is the minimum amount of control line that I need to keep this fire from, you know, getting outside the box. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, I showed you a permit example. Okay, let me talk a little bit about some programs that are available to you, the landowner, to put fire back on your land. The first one I want to mention is a great program. It kind of went away for a few years, or at least it kind of didn't happen very much, but it's really come back with a vengeance, and that's really exciting for me to see. Is CAL FIRE's VMP program, or Vegetation Management Program. Scott alluded to that in the past. It didn't go so well, and unfortunately that's a story that I've heard in other parts of the state as well. But I can tell you, and Chief Watson, if I miss anything, please chime in here. But I can tell you the VMP program has not only been resurrected in terms of more people doing it, but CAL FIRE has put a lot more time and money and resources into it. So now, under the VMP program, which is really exciting, one of the biggest changes, I think, is it's used to be a 3-year contract, now it's a 10-year contract with the landowner. And if Kitty wanted to burn, she would come to CAL FIRE and say, hey, I'm interested in entering in this VMP contract with you, what do I need to do? And they talk, they come up with a plan. It's 10 years. CAL FIRE will take a large portion of the cost of that, and that's also up to negotiation, correct?
Yeah, that's usually that's part of the agreement is the cost share, and maybe it's, like, just for an example, like we'll put in the control lines, you guys provide fuel, we'll bring people and help assist you.
Yeah. So it averages about 75-25, is that right?
Yeah, it can be pretty minimal in the landowner's favor.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, so on my experience is on average, CAL FIRE covers about 75% of the cost, the landowner covers about 25%. One of the cool things about it though is it doesn't necessarily have to be dollars as like writing a check, it can also be in-kind things, and that can include providing fuel for not only the equipment, but torch fuel, feeding the crews. Okay, there's a dollar value attached to that. You know, providing water, so firefighting water, that is. So there's some creative ways that landowners can, you know, satisfy that cost share requirement. Doing some of the work themselves. So rather than say CAL FIRE putting in the control lines, you know, you the landowner putting in the control lines. But the great thing about this program is CAL FIRE will come and actually do the burning for you. They'll provide, you know, all the resources, equipment, personnel, and of course CAL FIRE has a very, very deep resource pool. So, and the other thing that's very appealing to most landowners is CAL FIRE takes the liability in the event that there's an escape or the fire damages things that you don't want to do.
Does this also include fuel load reduction that doesn't involve fire?
Yes, you know, like mechanical thinning and stuff, yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
So it's a great program, and now that it's been extended to 10 years, I think, you know, hopefully we'll see more landowners taking advantage of it. Yeah.
Are the VMPs entered into on a landowner by landowner basis, or can it be a group of landowners who go in together?
So my understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, is you can get a group of landowners together. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they'll just have to sign the same agreement, but. Mm-hmm.
Is there an acreage maximum, or? for that?
So, because we're getting back into it, there is no real maximum, but I mean, just understand it's very hard to get all the resources on the same page required if you guys wanted to burn like say 6,000 acres all at once. That would be almost impossible to bring all those resources together to support a plan like that. But on that same token, like small little pockets of a very tiny acreage would also really not benefit the project, probably push it back versus some of the other projects for us. So we can look at the feasibility of whether or not we can provide that out and what's the overall benefit to the project.
Yeah, so maybe an ideal project would be sort of big enough to be worth the effort, but not too big that it's impossible
Or it just kind of needs to be separated into blocks, into different phases.
Right. I'll start with Scott first, because you're in the first.
So I have kind of a two-part question. First of all, have there been any studies done that show what is the amount of pollutants that are generated by these large, like this county fire last year was a 90,000 acre fire? How much pollutants go into the air on a per acre basis, or I don't know how to figure that kind of stuff, because of that event versus coming in and managing your land, grazing and prescribed burning and that kind of stuff. Second thing is, like these VMPs, you go through all this trouble to put all this together, you get all these resources and everything and ready to go, and then you never can get the air quality folks on the same page. And you can't get burns done because they won't let you get, because of the air quality issues. However, if you have the science to show that, look, if we don't do these prescribed burns, here's how bad it's going to be versus a smaller amount doing these prescribed burns. How do we get that moving forward? Because that's been a big log jam. That's supposed to be thousands of projects.
Absolutely. Great questions. So, to the first question, that was about the studies about particulate matter. Yes, there's been many papers that have come out in recent years, especially just in the last couple of years, and they clearly show that the amount of particulate matter and harmful smoke that's put into the air from a prescribed fire is significantly less than a wildfire. Not only because of the amount of fuels or vegetation that burns, because typically in prescribed fire, it's very rare to ignite a prescribed fire to deliberately create high intensity fire. I'm not saying that's never been done, and in fact I've done a few projects where that was our intent, is we really wanted to create high intensity fire, but that's pretty rare. Most of the time we're striving for moderate or low intensity fire, so the amount of vegetation that's burned is less, and therefore the particulate matter is less, but it's also the duration of it. A wildfire, once it gains steam, will burn for weeks or months even. Prescribed fire, most prescribed fires are usually done in a day, maybe a couple days. So yes, there's been lots of research that's shown that. Second, part two of your question is, so the air quality districts are aware of this issue, they're aware of the science, and my personal experience is it varies across the state. Some air districts are very much interested in getting more fire on the land for their perspective, for that reason, right? Because they are ultimately interested in reducing emissions over a longer period of time. I can say other air quality districts are a little slow to the party. They're more focused on immediate, short-term, and so they look at it as, well, any fire is putting smoke in the air, and we need to be concerned about that. I don't think we're ever going to, it'd be great, but I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where air quality districts just, issue a free pass to prescribed fire, which would be awesome. But I do think in some parts of the state, in many parts of the state, we're getting there.
I like Scott, on your part. I've done it for many years down in the lower hills. I've done it for Bruce Rominger. Talk to your local fire department, because if they can turn that, say, a 600 acre into a training burn, Air Pollution Board has no ruling. All we have to do is notify them on these dates, we are going to be doing training. We invite them out where they can see it. I've done it for several years. Now they don't even want to come out. That's the way of beating the Air Pollution Board. Now, for bigger ones up here, that would be a little bit harder. That would fall more under CAL FIRE, but the rolling hills, we've done that with farmers like Bruce. It talks to us, we'll come in and do it. And just take care of air pollution by saying we're doing a training burn. We like to do it this day. We'll do, say 600 acres, maybe 3 days, we'll do it. And that's how we get around it.
So if I could add just on to that is, so I've heard that done before, but that varies by air district. And I will say that you have to play that game a little cautiously because you can't turn every prescribed fire into a training burn because they'll catch on pretty quickly. It's like, hey, it sounds like you're doing all these burns as training burns. So, and at least, I can't speak for Solano Yolo. I'm not super familiar with the air district rules here, but I know in the Bay Area, because where I do most of my burning is in the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, you can pull the training card, but that's only good for once a quarter. And what it also means, and here's the kind of kicker to that, is every agency that shows up, that burn goes against their 1 a quarter. So if I get San Jose, Milpitas, Santa Clara, Mountain View all showing up, that means all those agencies can't burn for the whole quarter also. So it is a little bit of a game that you have to play.
Years ago, they had to prescribe burn way back up in here, and Yolo County would say burn, and East Bay would say you can't burn.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of that didn't get burned.
Yeah, and it's challenging when you're crossing
just cross the lines.
You had a question?
What kind of crews do you have? Where do you get the people?
So for me personally, I don't have any internal crews or resources of my own, but what I do is I hire or enter in agreements with collaborators and contractors and stuff. So my, and I've actually been remarkably fortunate to get the resources I need for my burns. The first place I usually start is the landowner or the landowner's friends and colleagues and neighbors. On ranches, and Scott can probably speak to this, is it's amazing how much internal capacity ranches actually have. We don't call them fire engines, and maybe that's just because they're not red and they don't have a light bar on the top. But they essentially function like engines. They carry water, they have a pump, we get some hose, bam, there's your engine. So a lot of times I get it from the landowners and ranchers. Volunteer fire departments and as well as career fire departments will often show up. The big hook for them is it's training. It's live fire training for the personnel. So I've usually been very successful that way. And then if I can't get that, then I'll hire contractors. There's an outfit in Chico called Firestorm, which is a large fire contractor.
What about that Conservation Corps?
The Conservation Corps, I've never used them, but that could be a resource for me, yeah. Thank you.
Within about the last week, I had somebody contact me about community burn associations.
Yes.
Do you know anything about that and how that's different from some of the other things you've been talking about?
I do, and if I could put my answer on hold for that, because that's actually, well actually, I guess it's right here. So let me jump to the last bullet item. In the Midwest and the Southeast, so if you look at fire across the United States, the 2 areas that burn the most every year in terms of acreage are the Southeast, specifically Florida, Georgia, that area, and the Midwest. They burn on the order of 1 million to several million acres a year. There's lots of reasons for that, but one of them is that I want to speak to is the culture of fire has been much more prominent and has been present for a much longer period than it has here. And so over time, what these places have done is they've developed what are called prescribed burn associations, or PBAs. And a PBA is nothing more than a loose collaboration of mostly just private citizens, some agencies or NGOs, so conservation organizations, Xerxes might be a good example of that. You know, so an agency like that, and they all get together for the purpose of putting prescribed fire on the land. It's really kind of neat because a colleague of mine, Laney Quinn Davidson, with the University of California Cooperative Extension, has actually started the first recognized PBA in Humboldt County. So I think we're going to see more of them here in California over the next couple of years. But the way Laney's PBA works, or the Humboldt County PBA, is it's made up of about, I think there's about 100 people in it. I'm one of them, even though I don't live in Humboldt County. I go there a fair amount for work. And mostly landowners who bring their own capacity to each of the burns. So if Scott was part of the PBA, then the agreement would be, if we're burning on your land, he agrees to, when possible, to bring his equipment and his boots and other people and his experience and knowledge, bring it to your property, do the burn on your property, and in return, you reciprocate and bring your equipment and experience and people when he needs it.
So is there training required to be a part of that?
So it varies by, each PBA has a different set of rules and bylaws. I know the one in Humboldt County is, there's no training or experience required to join, but the expectation is you'll get that training and experience when you come to your first burn. So most likely, if you're brand new, they're going to say, all right, well, since you're brand new, we're going to put you over here on either an observer role or a cold flame to the fire, where it's not going to be fast and furious, and then you slowly learn. You also take classes. A lot of PBAs now are bringing in outside trainers like myself to help teach basic firefighting skills, how to cut line, how to do a progressive hose lay, how to do a mobile attack, these kind of things, and eventually bring their people up to a minimum level of qualification. Yeah, they're really excited. Mm-hmm.
How does a PBA like that deal with liability for personal injury? How do they, if someone gets hurt in those operations, do you sign a waiver? Someone says, I retain all personal liability for the injury I get on fire?
Yeah, my understanding is for personal injury, do you sign a waiver that says, if I am participating on a burn and I get injured, I agree not to hold the PBA or the landowner liable for any injury that I sustain. Now, I will tell you this, because it's California, is that's never been tested in a court of law, and I hope it never is, because it's quite, I could very much see a scenario someday in the future, and again, I pray this doesn't happen, but someone does get injured, that person's attorney says, well, if the lines had been prepped a little better, my client would not have been injured, so it sounds to me like the landowner is responsible, and then it goes through that. And unfortunately, no one can control that or predict that. That's just the climate we live in. But I think the very act of signing a waiver that says you assume liability gets people kind of in the mindset of, hey, I'm doing this because I want to, and I recognize it's an inherently risky activity, but managed properly, you can reduce that risk quite significantly. And I have a slide later that talks a little bit about risk, perception versus reality. It's really interesting research. And then as far as escapes, like if a fire were to escape and get onto someone else's land, that I don't know what the answer to that is. I imagine it would probably default to the landowner, although the landowner might turn around and say it's the PBA's problem. One thing I can say though, however, is some PBAs get around that by hiring someone like myself who's qualified and has insurance. So that's the way they mitigate that risk, is they say, okay, now we're transferring liability to Phil, so if anything bad happens, it's on him.
But if CAL FIRE is involved, then they assume the risk, right?
Okay, so if CAL FIRE is doing the VMP, through their VMP program, yes.
Only through this.
Yeah, if they're showing up on a PBA burn, no, my understanding is they're there as a cooperator, not as a lead agency. So Now, that's not to say that someone isn't gonna say, well, hey, the red engine was parked over there, so let's go after them. But my understanding is if they're there just as a cooperator or assisting agency, then no, liability should not fall on them. That sounds all right to you. Okay, so a couple other programs. We talked about VMP. There's also the CFIP program, California Forest Improvement Program. I don't know as much about that, but that's also a program that's available if you're looking to do some kind of forest work or forest restoration work on your land. The state will provide you some money. It's a little bit different than the VMP program. I think it's mostly limited to technical expertise and funding. I don't think it's so much boots on the ground kind of stuff. Then here's something that's kind of exciting, especially for me, is NRCS is now getting into the business of prescribed fire. We're interested in help supporting prescribed fire on the ground. And they do that through what are called the Conservation Activity Plans, or CAPs. And they also have a program called the Technical Service Provider Program, TSP. And these are individuals and companies who have demonstrated to NRCS a minimum level of qualification and experience to perform this CAP. And last time I checked, I'm the only one in the state of California that's you know, been approved for prescribed burning. So it's a good opportunity for me.
Just a slight point of clarification.
Yeah.
Those are for developing the burn plans,
Yes.
not for lighting and conducting.
Thank you. Yes, I'm glad you pointed out. Yeah, so it's for writing the burn plan.
That's the CAP program?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure, you know, we can talk about that more later, or certainly you can answer any question. And this is still kind of in the ramp up phase. I'm getting ready to do my first NRCS burn this fall in Humboldt County.
Where do you see most of your conservation activity plan contracts at? In the foothills, the Sierra foothills?
I haven't been any in Sierras yet. It's all been in Humboldt County right now. And then there's just a lot of talk elsewhere. I mean, I think it will develop into something. But yeah, mostly just the North Coast right now. And the North Coast is kind of a good, easy place to start, because in terms of prescribed burning, it's a fairly forgiving territory. You know, it's down in the canyons, it's fairly wet and shaded. So, you know, any fire that does slop over, if it burns down into the canyon or into the forest, it's most likely, depending on time you're going to go out. You know, whereas other places, it's you know, Butte County is a good example. You know, it's a little more challenging. There's a lot of grant money out there for putting fire on the land. And then we talked about Prescribed Fire Council, and then I'll just briefly talk about TREX here. So TREX, as I mentioned earlier, is an acronym for Training Exchange. It's a program that's through the Nature Conservancy. And what a TREX is a landowner offers up his or her land to burn, and in exchange, the Nature Conservancy will bring a squad of people, anywhere from 20 to sometimes 100 people, depending on how many acres you have to burn. And these are people from agencies, private citizens, NGOs, tribal folks, and they come in and they do the burning for you. And again, there's a cost share there, but that's another program that's available. All right, sorry for the blurred slide there. So talk about burn plans here real quick. A burn plan is not always required, and what I tell landowners is when they say, I want to do burning on my land, do I need a burn plan? My default answer is usually, do you need one? That depends. Should you have one? Yes, absolutely. And there's a lot of reasons you need to have a burn plan. First and foremost, it's a risk management thing. If something bad were to happen, or unexpected were to happen, someone's going to say, well, what was the point of your burn? Did you know what environmental conditions you wanted to burn under? All these things. So I always tell people, you know, have a burn plan. Does it need to be big and robust? Well, that depends on what you're burning and what you need. For NRCS, if I'm burning under an NRCS contract, they require that I write a burn plan that matches this format here, which is the Interagency Prescribed Fire Planning and Implementation Guide. This is what the federal agencies use, and they have to use for prescribed fire. CAL FIRE has its own version of this. It's called VMP plan, and but that's what they use for their burns. And so a burn plan, and I apologize if that's hard to read, by the way. It looked great on my computer screen at home. And in my office, which is darker than this room. It doesn't look so great here. Again, I apologize. So I'll read these to you, but at a minimum, the burn plan should contain name of the landowner and who's in charge. That would be the burn boss if you hire a burn boss. The burn objectives, and that's a big one. Why are you burning? You know, people want to know that. Not only the agency that's giving you the permit, but your neighbors and the air quality district and many other people are going to know, why are you putting fire on the land? And you know, that's where you list all the reasons that you burn. What are the type of vegetation to be burned, and what are the weather conditions? That's a really key part of the burn plan, is you have to establish your maximum or hot end of the prescription and your minimum or cool end of the prescription. And what you, and what I often do is I put a desired in there too. What's my desired conditions? And then you have some flexibility in there.
Just to clarify, you're meaning I'm not going to burn if the outdoor temperature is hotter than this?
Yep.
Or I'm not going to burn if it's lower than this?
Yep, let me, that's a great question, and I'll segue into a specific example. So this is a prescribed burn I did on Humboldt County 2 years ago. I just saw the property a few months ago. It looks amazing. Although I can't take full credit for it. My landowner client was just a great person and really okay, so some of this is a little bit technical, but I think you can probably get it. So here's my prescription. You'll notice I have a low or cool end, a high hot end, and what my desired conditions are. So in the first row, this is just the fuel model, and that's based on a computer program that models fire behavior. So the 1 hour fuels, and what are 1 hour fuels?
Grasses.
Grasses, right. So under my desired conditions, the fuel moisture of the 1 hour fuels was 7%. The temperature 70, relative humidity 30, and the 20-foot wind speed and the mid-flame wind speed 8 and greater than 5. All right. Now I have a question for you. Why do you think I want to have a little bit of wind? Because some people say, well, wouldn't zero wind be better for control?
Get it to move.
Right. Exactly. You got to have a little bit of wind to get it to move, first of all. There's nothing more frustrating than burning under absolutely still conditions, because you tip the torch and the fire just spreads out at an amazingly slow rate of spread. So you need some wind to move it along, but also you need some wind to carry all that convective heat up and out. So you want to burn under a little bit of wind. But of course, I have a high end, because what happens if it gets too windy? Now it's a control issue, right? I'm chasing fire where I don't want to chase it. And then go down here, it specifies the transport wind, and the transport wind is the wind that carries the smoke, right? So in this particular plan, I specified the transport wind had to be west. Now, to me, what's really interesting about this particular burn plan is many other burn plans, I can be really flexible with transport. Sometimes it just says any, right? Because I don't really care where the smoke goes. It's all rural around me for the 10 miles. But in this particular burn, it had to be from the west, because that was the only acceptable wind direction that would keep smoke away from the community. I was burning above the community Shelter Cove, and if you know anything about Shelter Cove, it's a lot of retired folks, a lot of second homeowners, and they have zero smoke tolerance. And the mixing height, that's the height to which the smoke rises before it mixes fully with the atmosphere. Probability of ignition, that's simply if you take a spot and throw it into a receptive fuel bed, what's the probability that it's going to start a new fire? We'll talk about firing techniques in a minute. This is the average slope. It's fairly steep property. So slope being how many feet of rise over how many feet of run. So 45 feet up in elevation for every 100 feet out. That's fairly steep. And then my desired flame length and rate of spread. Yes, Katie?
Yeah, so when you only specified the 1%, the moisture for the 1% or 1 hour fuels, is that because that was all there was in the property, or that's like the limiting factor and it doesn't matter for bigger fuels?
Excellent question. So why not include the 10 and 100 hour fuels? Because in this particular case, the 1 hour fuels was really the primary carrier of the fire. So it didn't really matter how dry the 10 hours were. Well, actually, let me back that out. I mean, yes, it would matter, but under these environmental conditions, it was really the 1 hour fuels that were the primary carrier of the fire. I wasn't too concerned about the 10 hour fuels. And I just didn't think at that time of year they would be very receptive to burning. Now, if I rewrote this prescription for, say, August, where the 10 hour fuels are much more receptive to burning or consumption, then I might throw in a line that says, I only want my 10 hours to be this. Okay? Any questions?
Could you speak to some of the equipment that you use to get this information?
Equipment to get that information. Let's see, the simple answer is, comes from years of experience, I start with the burn objectives. That's the very first place I start. And that usually is my first meeting with the landowner. Hey Kitty, thanks for having me out today. Tell me why you want to burn. She tells me why she wants to burn. And we talk about, okay, here's what I can do for you. Here's what fire can do for you. And not sure we can do this objective with fire, or we might have to put that objective off for a couple of years. So start with the objective. And let's say, it's a hypothetical example, let's say yellow star thistle control. So she wants to burn for yellow star thistle control. Then based on that, I go back and I look at previous burn plans as well as the scientific literature, and I say, okay, what are the conditions that are ideal for yellow star thistle control? And if you look at the scientific literature, it's usually late spring, very late spring, early summer, where the seeds are still in the basal rosette of the star thistle plant, but the grasses and forbs underneath it are fully cured or mostly cured, so they'll carry fire. And I say, okay, well that's usually when the 1 hour fuel moistures are around 4 to 9%, let's say. Usually don't want to go much drier than that, because although it'll carry fire really well, it might carry the fire a little faster and hotter than I want. So then I start with that and say, okay, well that's my 1 hour fuel moisture. And then there's this computer program, it's called Behave. And I enter these environmental parameters and I look at my flame length, my rate of spread, and based on that I come up with a prescription, and then all these other things kind of fall in line.
How do you determine the amount of the percentage moisture in the fuel?
So the 1 hour fuel moisture is determined from the temperature and the relative humidity. So you can do that with, anybody ever use a Kestrel or know what a Kestrel is? It's a little pocket weather meter. And they've really improved a lot in the last few years. You can also do it old school with the old sling psychrometer that had the dry bulb, wet bulb, and then you spun it around in the air. So your Kestrel or your sling psychrometer will give you the temperature, and then you can either read the RH directly from the Kestrel or calculate it with the psychrometer. And once you have the temperature and the relative humidity, then you consult these tables that are produced by the NOAA, the same people that run the Weather Service, and it will tell you dry bulb here, wet bulb here, there's your RH, and then you enter that into, you take that information, you look at another table, and it will give you your 1 hour fuel moisture. And now 10 hour fuel moistures can be estimated or pretty closely calculated from the 1 hour, although more commonly how we get 10 hour fuel moistures are, has anybody ever seen fuel sticks? They're 4 wooden dowels. They're about this long. I wish I had brought some. They're about this long, and they're 4 wooden dowels of uniform diameter and length. And when it's dry, it weighs 100 grams. And then you put it out in your property, and you let it equilibrate for a couple days, usually in the shade, and then you go out every several days and with a scale, you weigh it, and you can, once you hang the sticks on the scale, there's a calibrated scale that will point to the fuel moisture percentage. Yeah. Questions? It's getting kind of warm here, sorry, I'll try to speed this up. All right, I think that's it. All right, so what else does a burn plan have? God, that is a terrible slide, I apologize. So you should definitely have a map. Right, everybody needs to know where you're burning, and this is also helpful for the people that are showing up. So I get Ellen and Kitty showing up at my burn, you know, and I'm burning 100 acres. You know, I need to show them, hey, here's where we started. This is where our control line is. Procedures that are used to confine fire within the desired boundary. And Chief, correct me if I'm wrong here, but that's usually something that CAL FIRE definitely wants to know is, okay, it's great that you're doing the burning, you know, your prescription looks good. Tell me a little bit about how you're going to keep this fire in the box, because we don't want to have to come out and put the fire out for you. And then equipment that will be on hand. Also in the burn plan, you probably want to talk about areas that may be impacted by smoke. The smoke people will definitely want to see that. And oftentimes they ask you to produce a smoke trajectory map. And you're showing on a map where you estimate your smoke to be going, so they can do some calculations. How are you going to ignite it, and what devices are you going to use? What are your contingencies in case something unwanted occurs? And then what are the notifications that need to be made? At a minimum, your burn plan should have all those things. So, if I may, let me go back to the burn plan I had up here a minute ago. And you'll see, I'm not going to go through all of this for you. But, so in this particular burn plan, you know, there's a signature page and some checklist, okay? This is what's called the complexity analysis, and this is a thing that I do prior to the burn, and I estimate, okay, what are these categories here: safety, fire behavior, smoke management, constraints, and so on. What's the risk? How did I mitigate that risk through the burn plan? And what's the technical difficulty of that risk, of implementing that? That gives me a final determination, and it's really interesting. This is all based on a spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet. You would think, looking at this table, it would come in as moderate, because there's a lot of moderates, and yet for whatever reason, it finally came out as a low. I don't have control over the math, but then just a description. And again, this is really helpful for an agency like CAL FIRE, whoever's approving your burn, you know, as well as the smoke people. Where is this located? Tell me a little bit about it. So on and so forth. Tells you a little bit about the fuels here. And then here's really, in my opinion, sort of the meat of the heart of the burn plan. If this is the heart, the goals and objectives, then the prescription is the brains. But here's the objectives. So here's our goals, which are big, you know, 30,000 pie in the sky kind of statements. And then there's objectives, which if you know the acronym SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic. These are my SMART objectives. So reduce fuel loading in the 1 hour fuel class by greater than or equal to 70%. Reduce fuel loading in the 10 hour fuel class by greater than or equal to 50%. And then I threw in a training objective because one of the objectives of this burn was to help the PBA, the Humboldt PBA, get some experience. Okay, a little bit about funding. Then we already did the prescription.
Could you go back to the funding?
Oh yeah.
Just for a second.
I had a quick question. For evaluating the success of whether or not you met those objectives, do you just do a visual observation?
So that's a great question. How do you know you met your objectives? So there's a number of ways to do it. For most landowners, they're not interested, nor do they have, well, I shouldn't say they're not interested. That's not fair. They are interested. They just often don't have the time and the resources and the money to invest in really robust monitoring. So many times it is just, you know, what I call ocular measuring, which is looking at it. Now what I do though is I encourage landowners to take pictures, especially establishing what are called photo points. So, you know, taking a picture at a specific location in a specific direction, and do that over, you know, a period of time, say months or even years, and you can see just by looking at it the changes and whether, and in many cases, oftentimes you can see whether you met your objectives or not. If you have a burn that requires more specific measurements, then there's all sorts of different monitoring protocols. Cool. Yeah, question on the cost?
No, I just wanted to glance.
Okay. Yeah, Scott.
So that's a 10-acre burn?
That is a 10-acre burn.
Is your prep time included in that number?
Yes. So don't get too wrapped around this funding. This is my cost as well as the homeowner's cost. So I didn't get paid this amount of money. If that's what you're wondering. I wish. This was the cost of everything it took to do this burn. This is the cost of the landowner, and here's the interesting thing, is this is my estimate and the landowner's estimate of his or her time, okay? Even though, you know, when you work on your own land, we often don't think about, well, it's my land, you know, I'm gonna do it whether it costs this much or not. But I throw that in there, and the reason I do that is it's helpful for me and for my clients to see a cost per acre estimate. That's really why I do this.
Which is $1,000.
$1,000 an acre.
$1,000.
Yeah, which is a little on the high side.
Is that realistic?
On this particular burn, yeah. This was a small parcel. It was only 10 acres, but really steep, and in an area surrounded by a lot of heavy volatile fuels. This really was, the burn plan's a little misleading, and the complexity analysis was really, you know, a fairly complex burn. In this particular case, I think it was fairly accurate. Maybe a little on the high end. For rangelands, I've come in as low as $100 an acre.
It seems like you're kind of where the tire meets the road, since there's going to be tons of energy and interest and activity in this area, prescribed burning, generating data, numbers, real-time numbers of what it actually costs to get it done now will help funding sources and applicants to have some accurate data to be able to pinpoint. So as a landowner, I don't get sticker shock if I commit to some project and then later get bid.
Right. So,
etc.
That's a great point, and that is kind of one of my, you know, big picture motivations in putting this in the burn plan. I have a colleague of mine who said, "Why do you even put this in there? It's stupid. It doesn't really matter."
Well, money's money.
Well, and that's really kind of what you know drives us, right? Is there's probably thousands of landowners in California who might be more amenable to burning, but you know, cost is permitting and all that other stuff, of course, smoke management. But cost is a big one, and so my attempt at this is to say, okay, here's a ballpark figure. Yeah. There's some give and take. Another thing I didn't mention is this also includes the cost to the volunteer agencies for showing up. So their estimate for how much, you know, time their people are worth and their equipment and all that. And maybe Bob can speak to this a little bit, but NRCS, so through their program is they fund burn plan writing at a specific amount. And they fully admit, so your boss is Chris, right? Chris and me?
He's not my boss.
Okay.
Totally.
So Chris Zimney is the state forester for NRCS. And Chris, if he was here, would fully admit that the amount of reimbursement that the NRCS provides for burn plan writing is not the full cost of what it actually is. It's a percentage of that. And right now it's a little, I think frankly, a little on the low end, but every year or a couple years NRCS goes back and they revisit these numbers and they say, is this really high enough? Maybe we need to nudge that reimbursement up a little bit. And that's kind of one of my big picture goals too, is to get agencies that are funding these things to, you know, kind of bump it up a little bit, make it more appealing.
So when we write different kinds of plans for, you know, hedgerows or restoration projects for landowners where there's cost share involved, and I think maybe you could just add a separate column that says CAL FIRE.
Yeah.
You know, and how that's being covered. That will help explain what you're describing, and I can clarify that table.
That's a great point, Heather, and I have thought about that for the future. Is I should probably flesh this out in a little more detail to say who's paying what and how much.
And we could put landowner in-kind match too at some time, and it's in there as well.
Well, your 200 doesn't cover beer.
It does not cover the beer, right? Well, see, I noticed I kept it as beverage. So. But that's after the fire done, of course. All right, so let me just walk you through some more of this here. So there's the prescription. Here's the scheduling. Okay, I wrote this very broadly. So basically it says anytime the unit's in prescription. Although most likely, knowing the North Coast, you really only going to get this kind of conditions in the fall. Maybe a real brief window in the winter or early spring. And then a whole big paragraph on some pre-burn considerations. You know, I'm not going to read this to you, but these are, you know, covers the kind of things that need to take place before you light the match. How weather's going to be obtained and smoke management. Here's some notifications. Organization and equipment. So how many people, how many engines, and what kind of supplies you need. Communication, if you're going to use radio frequencies, how you're going to talk to people. Some thoughts about public and personnel safety. So safety hazards, measures taken to reduce them, and what are your emergency medical procedures. How are you going to light your test fire? So what a test fire is before you do any prescribed burn, you should always have a test fire. And test fire is a small area of the burn unit, usually on the downwind uphill side, not always, but usually on the downwind uphill side. And basically it's a way to light the fire, and you might, the size of the test fire really depends on the fuels and a bunch of other, but let's say we light it as big as this room. So we do test fire as big as this room, and then we just stand back and we watch. And we say, okay, is the fire doing, number one, what we expect it to? Is it burning with the intensity that we want? Is it the rate of spread that we want? If we're trying to kill yellow star thistle, does it appear to be doing that? Or do we light the match and it fizzles, hardly goes anywhere? Like, okay, maybe we need to postpone burning until we get better conditions. Or it does the opposite. You light it and it goes, whoa. All right, that's burning a lot hotter than we want. The idea being is you have resources there to immediately suppress the test fire if it's, you know, burning hotter than you want it to. But so it tells you a little bit about test fire, and then what's your plan for lighting this thing? What's your plan for holding this thing? We always in a burn. I always put in a burn plan a statement about contingency, because what I'm trying to demonstrate to the agency that's approving it, as well as anybody that's looking at this, is that I and the landowner have had a conversation and said we need to talk about what happens if this thing ends up doing something we don't want it to. So here I talk a little bit about what's our contingency plan, and to show that we're doing our due diligence, the next element is what are we going to do if things really go bad and we have to convert this to a wildfire. I was going to show this video, but we're kind of out of time, but it essentially shows you the different filing techniques and how to build a control line. Okay, so next thing is you got to figure out a place to start. Again, it's usually, not always, but usually on the downwind and uphill side of the unit. It's on the downwind because you're bringing the fire into the wind, so it's a lot easier to control. Generally, there are some exceptions, but generally you're not lighting with the wind, because what happens? Off it goes. And if you're not careful, if you don't have a really good catcher's mitt on the downwind side, your prescribed fire knowledge has become escape fire. Same thing with top, starting at the top, fire runs really fast uphill. Generally you want to start at the top, bring it down slowly. Figure out how you're going to fire. There's all different kinds of firing methods. There's what's called backing fire, flanking fire, head fire, strip fire, dot fire, ring fire, chevrons, all these different things. Again, a competent person, either a contractor or a landowner who's got lots of experience, can help you with that. Decide on when you want to do this, not only seasonality, but also during the ignition, what's your timing? When do you want to run strips across the unit? When do you want to not? Okay, determine if the weather parameters will be met. You should have somebody taking the weather not only before but during your burn, and during is really important, because if you've written a prescription or somebody's written a prescription and you need to stay within that prescription, if nobody's monitoring the weather and you're looking and you're saying, wow, our fire really seems to be burning pretty actively, hopefully somebody taking the weather and saying, yeah, well, we've actually exceeded the high end of our prescription.
What are you talking about? Checking the weather? What are you checking?
Oh, I'm sorry. Checking the weather means taking the temperature, calculating the RH or reading the RH at a minimum, and then measuring the wind speed and direction.
So you're doing it actually on the site as
Yes.
opposed to
Yes.
looking at yourself?
Yep. Yeah, it's always better to do it on site. I don't recommend the cell phone because the weather forecast that you get off the internet that's for a very large synoptic area, and Chief Watson, I'm sure you probably speak to this too as well. Conditions on the burn unit can be a lot different than what they appear to be on a broader scale.
And wind can change every hour.
Yeah, I've been on some burn units where it's been maddening. It's like just when I thought I had the wind predicted, it shifts again. It's like,
The fire changes that too.
What's that?
The fire itself changes.
And the fire definitely changes, right? As you create more black, you're now creating more heat and you're getting some, vertical instability. Okay, you need to figure out a way to talk to people. Yelling usually doesn't work very well. Whether that's cell phone, I don't recommend cell phone either, because everybody probably needs to hear what you're saying. So usually radios are the preferred method. For private landowners, you can get those, what do they call them? Walkie-talkies, that's not the right word.
Those yellow Walkman things.
Yeah, the little yellow things you can buy at Costco. They usually come in a pack of 4 or whatever. And those work really well, especially on flatter ground where, the topography is not gonna create a problem. If you have fire agencies that show up, and most fire agencies now share common frequencies, so you can, with approval, you can talk on those frequencies. Okay, so some other things, make sure your equipment's safe and working, make sure you've got all the documentation you need, check the weather, okay, look for any danger spots. We talked about notifications. Posting signs is usually pretty good. It can be a handmade sign, although if you want to invest the money for those fancy orange signs, those are nice too, or borrow them. Make sure that your fuel moistures meet your prescription parameters. Conduct your test burn, that's critical. You got to do a test burn. I can remember one burn I was on a couple years ago where I wasn't leading it, but I showed up that day and they were doing the test burn, and I was on the other side of the unit, and they got on the radio and said, hey, we're doing the test burn. Okay, copy. Test burn went off. I looked up and I go, well, I guess we're burning, because there was no, this thing really kind of took off. Now, fortunately, it stayed in the box, but I don't think it was really so much of a test burn. So we talked about that later, of course. And that's the main reason. You want to make sure that it's meeting your objectives and that you can keep control of this thing. Okay. We talked about that. And then you got to be able to put this thing out if it's not meeting your objectives. Okay, we talked about ignition technique. I can talk about ignition techniques. So let's talk about backing fire. That's the most commonly used ignition technique in prescribed fire. Here's the wind, and you're lighting on the downwind side. Okay, so if I'm lighting on this side, fire is going to go to the road and then it's going to stop, right? because it's going to run out of fuel. So the only direction that this fire can spread is against the wind. Vacuum fire is great because it consumes the fuel much more completely than a head fire does. What do you think the biggest downside of the vacuum fire is though?
May not move.
Yeah, it's really slow. Right, and sometimes painfully slow. So at some point, you know, you're gonna have to speed this thing along because it's like, all right, we can't be here all day.
Well, and so in that case, would you just, you know, go so many yards upwind and just light another chunk off and then light another chunk off?
It's exactly what you do, and that's called strip head firing. Okay? So in strip head firing, what you're doing is you're building your downwind catcher's mitt first, okay, creating black as we call it. Then once you have enough black here that you think will be able to hold any head fire that comes at it, then this is exactly what you do. You go out into the unit and you lay down a strip of fire. Well, now there's unburned fuel between here, so this fire is going to burn very rapidly toward your catcher's mitt. But it's going to hit your catcher's mitt and of course go out. And you do the same thing here. Essentially you stagger your way across the burn unit. Sometimes you do what's called flanking fire, where you want the fire to spread laterally. And so oftentimes what this means is your lighters are walking into the wind. This is a technique that I've used sometimes, particularly when we talk about oak mitigation. It's a variant of ring firing, where you just drop spots in places and let them all burn together. Oh, there you go. So there's point source where all the points burn together. There's ring firing, and this might be a tree or a telephone pole or a building even. And then this is chevron firing, we're not going to talk about that. And it doesn't show head fire, but I think you get the idea of head fire, right? As you're lighting on the uphill side and you're just letting it rip, or upwind side. Okay, these are just different ignition techniques. We talked about that. It's important that you have proper clothing. Now, you as a landowner may not have nomads and helmets and all that fancy gear. So what do you think you as a homeowner can do though for protective clothing?
Long sleeves.
Okay, long sleeves.
Non-synthetic.
Non-synthetics. So cotton, wool. Okay. Gloves for sure. Don't necessarily have to have a helmet. It's always a nice idea. But, you know, a hat probably at a minimum. And that's probably mostly just to keep the sun off your head.
Can you sell boots?
Yes, boots. Thank you. So these are my wildland boots. But, you know, any well-soled boot that comes up, you know, the further it comes up, the better. Make sure that whatever boot you have does not have a bunch of glue in the sole that's going to melt if you're walking across hot grass or hot embers and then leave you soleless. That's bad. Yeah, and then, you know, earplugs are always a good idea because you never know if you have to whip out a chainsaw. Eye protection, I always encourage eye protection, even grass, because, you know, it kicks up all that ash and whatnot and gets in your eye. It's really irritating.
Wet bandana.
Well, actually a bandana, but not wet.
Really?
Yeah, so the idea behind that is that if a wet bandana gets hot enough, the moisture in that bandana converts to steam, and then you inhale that steam, and that's really bad. Yeah, dry bandanas. Or some of these helmets, well, actually fire agencies in California require a shroud, which is a piece of cloth that comes down from the helmet and then encapsulates the whole neck and face. That's important right there. Smile. Wear your smile on prescribed ring, and you will, because it's a lot of fun. A lot of fun, and it's really satisfying work. What not to wear? Okay, I think I have a slide in here that had some synthetic stuff. I don't know if these videos will play. I only want to show you the one on, oh, I'm sorry. I only want to show you the one on the right. I'm not sure this is going to play. Oh, this isn't the video I was thinking of, but anyway, what I'm trying to show here, I'll stop it here, is what's happening in this video. Smoke across the road, okay? And you guys have lots of county roads here. How fast do people drive on these county roads? Sometimes pretty damn fast, okay? And particularly because, you know, ag burning is not an uncommon practice here in the valley, right? So sometimes people are like, they're just ag burning, you know, and you gotta be aware that people are gonna be buzzing across or right by your burn unit. So, you know, station spotters or have signs. You might even have to have flaggers if smoke gets really bad. Important point to remember is smoke across the roadway is your responsibility. So if there's an accident, they can come after you because they'll say it was your responsibility to mitigate that smoke. We talked about communication, so how do you staff your burn? So some positions to consider is you usually always have to have a burn boss. Now, that can be both a formal burn boss in terms of actual qualification, or it can just be somebody who's in charge of the burn. Someone who's got oversight for the whole burn, the lighting and the holding and smoke, everything, who's kind of keeping an eye on it. You may or may not need a firing boss, depends on the size and complexity of your unit. You definitely will need igniters, however, people to light the fire. I don't recommend this being the burn boss because as soon as you put a torch to the ground, you're losing your big picture. And then of course you have to have holding people, depending on the complexity of your burn. You may have to designate somebody to supervise that entire holding organization or not. But you're going to have people and equipment, crews to hold and patrol, and then some other, God, that is a terrible slide, I'm sorry.
Smoke monitor.
Smoke monitor, a weather observer, and, logistics. Somebody to feed and water your people. That's on private burns, that's usually a great, and for those of you who are interested in doing it, if you want to get your neighbors to show up, feed them. If you feed them, beer, possibly afterwards. Okay, so you should never leave a fire until it's cold and out. And this is just a face page of numerous examples. Well, I shouldn't say numerous, but some examples of prescribed fires that got out of the box. Sometimes I got out of the box weeks after ignition. So, you know, most commonly in the case of weeks, it was in a forested ecosystem. It burned down into the roots below ground, and then the burn was not staffed. Nobody was out there, and then on any given day, pops back up, and away it goes. So, so you got to make a consideration for that. And here's just some videos of mop-up and patrol. Okay, smoke management. I think we all know we have an obligation to minimize that smoke impact. Understanding, Scott, to your point earlier, is air quality districts, you gotta work with them a little bit. Be prepared, I'll give you this as sort of food for thought, is be prepared for the air quality district to try and tweak your acreage. So you may want to burn 100, they might say we can only authorize 50. So, and I think Chief Watson spoke to this earlier, is what's a really good idea in your burn units is, if at all possible, create blocks, different segments of your burn unit, so that if you have a really great burn day and air quality says, hey, everything looks great, burn as much as you want, then you can burn the whole shebang. Or if you have a day where you've got people, you really want to get fire on the ground, but it's kind of a marginal day, you're still in prescription, but smoke forecast isn't so great, air quality says, well, we'll give you 25 of your 100 acres. If you've got, you know, blocks that are roughly equal to that, you can go out and grab those. So. Smoke's inevitable, you know, how you manage it. Here's a big takeaway point here, is how well you manage it often determines the acceptance of this in the future. Not only from air quality, but your neighbors. If you smoke out your neighbors, you know, it's going to be hard to get them on board. But if you do a good job, I'm not saying you can't send them smoke at all, that's going to be a little hard, but if the smoke is really light, almost imperceptible, you know, and I've even had neighbors say, wow, I didn't even know you burned last week. I didn't smell a thing. So, so how you manage that is really key. Okay, and then, you know, every air quality district has a smoke management plan, a template for a smoke management plan. Oftentimes, if you want to do just a really down and dirty smoke trajectory map, is figure out where your wind's coming from, draw a line on your map, and go out 30 degrees from each side of that. And that gets you pretty good. And if that's all the air quality district wants, then great. If they want more data, more science into it, then you can do that too. Or get your burn boss to do that if you're hiring somebody to write a burn plan. Be aware of smoke sensitive areas, so homes, schools, roadways, airports, things of that nature. Okay. Oftentimes the fuel type you have will determine how much smoke you're going to produce. If you have a lot of heavy fuels, they will usually cause the most concern because they burn with a lot, there's more to burn, first of all. The smoke is usually black and it's pretty thick and it's dry, and or wet, actually it'll be white and smoky, but it also burns for a long period of time. Okay, here's a web portal for the Yolo Solano Air Quality Management District, and we're going to get through these. Well, I'm almost done. And then it's always important to go afterwards and do a burn evaluation. So one of the things I always do, without exception, after every burn, is I do a debrief, or in the fire agency lingo, we call it an after-action review. And afterward, if you were all on my burn, we ignite this thing, we hold it, and it's either out or it's smoldering, and maybe a couple people are out there kind of keeping eyes on it, but the rest of us all come back and we say, hey, Kitty, what do you think went well today? Joanne, what do you think we could have improved on? You know, so on. And we go around, and it's really designed as a learning tool, right? What went well? What were some things that challenged us, and how do we mitigate them? How can we improve on that next time? And I think it's really key that you do that after every burn, so that you take away those lessons learned. And then, in addition to that, you're going to want to go back and, as Zach kind of mentioned, is how do you do some burn evaluation and monitoring? And it can be all the way from just simple photo monitoring to really robust science-based stuff, which I don't want to get into. But if you have a question about that, I'm happy to answer that after the presentation. Okay, did you meet your objectives? And if not, why? And how can you tweak your burn for the future? Did you follow the burn plan? Okay. Now, I'm not going to say that I'm the perfect student. There have been on some occasions I have gone slightly, not majorly, slightly outside the conditions of my burn plan, because once I got out there, I saw that, you know, burning under this prescription was never going to work. So I needed to tweak it a little. But here's the key thing. If you're going to do that, document it and have a justification or a rationale for that. Because in the absence of that, and again, if something goes sideways, you've got some protection. The other thing too is document it, because you want to know that for the future. Hey, this burn prescription really wasn't a good one, but I think this one is. Did all the parameters, you know, were you within all your parameters? Were there any escapes? If so, you need to document that. Was the technique correct? Did you have any, you know, rogue agents out there who need to be talked to? And was it within, did it meet your budget? Did you come in under budget, over budget? And how can you improve on future burns? Okay, it's my second to last slide. It's a terrible slide, but again, I'll share this with you. Well, it's terrible given the lighting in here. But CAL FIRE Lake Napa Unit, LNU, is available to help you. So that's the main number to their headquarters in St. Helena. Call them up, say, hey, my name is Phil Dye, I live so-and-so, and I'm interested in doing some prescribed burning on my land. Who can I talk to? And they'll direct you to the right person. This is the phone number and website for the Yolo Solano Air Quality Management District. Get on board with them early and start engaging in the dialogue early. Another reason for that is many air quality management districts have a lead time, a required lead time. So in the Bay Area, they want my smoke management plan 30 days before plan ignition. Other air quality management districts, I can send it the day before. but find that out ahead of time because you don't want to be unpleasantly surprised. University of California Cooperative Extension. I don't know how much the Cooperative Extension here in the Valley is engaged in this, but I know they're ramping it up because I know Cooperative Extension in Humboldt, I know Cooperative Extension in Calaveras County, down in Ventura. A lot of these Cooperative Extension offices are really interested in this fire thing. I'm pretty sure the folks in Davis have somebody or either on staff or somebody that you can talk to, then you can talk to. And then of course local fire agencies can help you out, private contractors like yourself, as well as fellow landowners. Don't forget your neighbors. I'll bet there's a lot of people out there, or parents of people who can tell you a little bit about how to do this. Just take what they say with some measure of perspective. Keeping in mind that if someone tells you, well, 50 years ago we used to do it like this, I'm not saying that's bad information, but clearly 50 years ago conditions were much different than they are today. Okay, this is just an acknowledgement slide of all the people that helped me to prepare this presentation. And then, see the smiles? Spreading fire happiness, that's what I do. I think when you get out there and do it, it's, how many people have actually been on a prescribed burn? Okay, did you enjoy yourself? Yeah, it's fun and it's extremely satisfying work. That's all I have.
How, in your experience, how long is a burn plan good for?
Good question. How long is a burn plan good for? So my burn plans all have expiration dates. And I do that for two reasons. Number one, as a risk management technique. I don't want somebody burning off of my burn plan that's 10 years old because a lot changes in 10 years. So that's one reason. The other reason is because things change a lot or can change a lot, I want to put some kind of stopgap or sort of turnstile in there that says when we reach this point, let's stop and take a look at the burn plan and see if it still applies to the landscape. So, but more specifically is I've written burn plans that are only good for a year because I know in a year's time things are going to change a lot. I've written burn plans that are good for 5 years. Beyond me, this is just me personally. Beyond 5 years, I start to get a little nervous because even in grasslands, which are fairly consistent year after year, since it is mostly grass, they respond really quickly to climatology. So if you have a really wet year, you get a huge, robust grass crop. If you get a dry year, not so much. So 5 is about my upper.
So an observation, the back part of the ranch burned about 30 years ago back in the BLM ground. The rest of the ranch, it's probably been 70, 80 years since they had that kind of fire here. One thing that we've been trying to burn for years because there's just so much dead wood and old stumps and old brush pits, brush patches and stuff. And so the fire came through and burned everything. But the problem was it was with such intensity because of the fuel load that we now have a bigger problem this year than we had before the fire because there's so many dead trees and dead bushes that died during the fire. They didn't burn up in the fire, but now, I mean, you pretty much can't go anywhere without a chainsaw all the time because everything just keeps falling. It's been dead since for a year, and it's probably a bigger problem now than it was before the fire. So we really need another fire to clean up all the damage from last year's fire.
Right. That's a great point, Scott, and I've seen this problem all across the state. So one of my projects I'm working on right now is in Amador County, where the sand fire in 2014, sand fire came through and burned this person's property. Unfortunately, they lost their home too. But now her property is full of standing dead trees and shrubs, big tall shrubs, just primed to burn again. So one of the things that we decided to do is she's hired a forester who's come in with a mechanical fuels crew, and they've cut down a lot of these standing dead trees, and they pile them, and then come this winter or spring when it's wet, we're gonna go out there and we're gonna pile burn all that good stuff. So, and that's just one technique. But yeah, it's unfortunately that's, you know, and so I guess my other point was I wanted to say about that is many times landscapes are not just ready to burn right now. You have to do a little bit of work ahead of time, meaning you might have to do some thinning. You know, there might be so many shrubs or overgrown dense trees that you need to limb up before you can even think about putting fire on them.
Does anybody ever ask you for biochar?
I've never been asked for biochar. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about it.
It might be a coming thing, I don't know.
It might be, I don't know. I mean, I've talked to people who say it's, you know, it's the latest, greatest thing since Betamax. Well, we know it happened to Betamax.
I was wondering about the necessity of follow-up burns for noxious weed control. Some of the literature I've looked at for stuff like star thistle, you really get the best results when you burn every single year for 5 years in a row. To get complete control. So I'm just curious, with your vast experience, have you seen that kind of thing with follow-up burns, or do you get good control given just one burn?
That's a great question, and it really goes back to what it is you're trying to accomplish with your burn. So in your first example, yellow star thistle, absolutely. The literature is pretty clear now that you have to burn every year for 3 years, or do some kind of treatment every year for 3 years. And what I mean by that is you might burn year 1, year 2 is chemical, year 3 is mechanical, mowing, and then hopefully in the winter after the 3rd year, you get some good rain, everything comes back up, you do one final burn, and you're good. Good for a period of time, because it will eventually come back. So that's kind of the case with YST, yellow star thistle. Other burn units, you can burn and be pretty good for a couple years. In the fire science world, we often talk about what's called fire return interval, and that is the interval between historic fires. And when I say historic fires, I'm talking pre-European contact, and mostly when it was just Native Americans who populated the land, or what was just naturally occurring fire. So grasslands have a fire return interval about 1 to 5 years on average. Forested ecosystems, 30 to 100 years.
Right. I guess I should have clarified, but I was just talking more about noxious weeds in a grassland setting, because obviously you wouldn't want to burn an oak woodland every year, you lose all your trees.
Right, correct.
But yeah, that's really cool to hear that, because I've got to check out Big Creek Chico Reserve with Don Hankins.
Oh yeah.
And he has shown some of the areas there where, he claims that 5 years ago these fields were 100% cover star thistle, and by doing consistent burning every year, the natives actually came in on their own. So now you can't find any star thistle in some of these areas, and it's just amazing the relationship that native plants have with fire, especially if you do it consistently.
Right. And you mentioned earlier in your introduction about cultural burning, and I didn't really talk about that in my presentation, but that's a great example of how Native Americans were really, in tune with using fire as a resource management tool. As they were using fire to manage for very specific reasons, and I gotta believe invasive control is certainly one of them. Another cool example of cultural burning is up in the Klamath River country on the Yurok and Karuk tribal lands. Is they burn for basketry because they're big basket makers, and so hazel is one of the plants they use for basketry. And if it's not burned, the shoots will come up and they'll be crooked, and it's really hard to work into baskets. But if they burn it regularly, they come up nice and straight, and it's perfect for basketry. So
we actually burned redbud at the preserve for that exact reason, for the basketry material.
Just, I don't know how involved you were with the PBA, the Prescribed Burn Association in Humboldt, but I'm curious, what, if you were involved, what were the kind of key ingredients that helped that form? Who was involved, who was important in forming that? How did it coalesce?
That's a great question. So I gotta believe a big reason for it is the people involved, specifically this colleague of mine I mentioned earlier, Laney Quinn Davidson, really sort of, again, pardon the pun here, picked up the torch and really ran with this idea of PBA.
Who do they work for?
She works for UC Cooperative Extension. Now in Laney's case, Laney had the advantage, she had the time and the funding and the blessing of her agency to do that. So I think for all of us here in the room today, if you're thinking about doing a PBA, that's kind of one of the first things you have to consider is who are the people, who is the person or people who have the time, the funding, the commitment to dedicate to ramping up a PBA type model. So that's the first thing. Second thing is the culture of the North Coast is very burning friendly. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong here, Chief, but I think the Humboldt unit of CAL FIRE burns, you know, they rank all the units of CAL FIRE, which one gets the most acres. And I think the Humboldt unit is either at the top or very near the top. Now, of course, you know, to be fair to the rest of the units in CAL FIRE, part of it is it's coastal and not inland. But they have a long experience in burning, and so part of it's the culture, the fire agencies buy into it. And then the third thing is landowners. You know, the landowners, probably like landowners around here, you know, they can remember the day when, you know, they were burning on their grandfather's farm or their father's farm or mother's farm.
I'm interested in creating a VMP with CAL FIRE in a very strategic fire area where we live. What's a timeline you would suggest when to start it, and how long do you think that process would take? Because there's going to be a number of stakeholders involved in that process.
Right.
I know as soon as possible. Is there a time of year?
So I can let Chief Watson answer this, but my understanding is you're right. Sooner is better. I would say at a minimum, you probably don't want to talk about a year out because it takes that long for CAL FIRE to put it in their system, to vet it, to figure out how they're going to implement it, get all the people on board. The other thing too is when you hire CAL FIRE to do a VMP, they have certain legal requirements, most notably CEQA, which is California Environmental Quality Act. And CEQA says you have to do you have to take into consideration the ecological effects of your burning, the archaeological effects of your burning, and that takes time. Yeah. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
You nailed it. I mean, that's the process that really holds us up as far as being able to assist with landowners is that entire CEQA process. We do not have enough folks that are familiar with that process to help speed things up, so it falls on one or two people for a department where you have every community in the counties trying to push their burn through and what gets the priority. So that's part of the challenges we're facing, is kind of bringing our own folks up to speed with how to streamline this.
So maybe that's not a great route to go, to accomplish an objective or plan. Maybe working through your organization with some grant money in the university. We have neighbors that are all vested in this Audubon. There's a whole bunch of players that are in our adjacent, you know, right there.
Right.
So maybe we avoid the CEQA because, you know, who wants to do that?
Well, so I'm here to tell you, maybe you can avoid CEQA. Maybe is the key word. Right, because if you're getting grant money, state grant money or federal grant money, you're probably going to have to do CEQA.
So that's a good
So we have a grant code going on in the lake now, the Sonoma unit, right, where the RCDs CAL FIRE is talking to RCDs about helping with the CEQA part. And providing support. So we're in discussion now on that. That's probably going to still take half a year to get in place. But I see in this room several entities, you know, CAL FIRE, the fire departments, NRCS interested, Point Blue, the Cache Creek Conservancy, and I just kind of want to propose maybe an ad hoc, you know, group to start talking to each other. And the RCD we could try leading that, or if somebody else wants to do that. okay if we, after this workshop, contact everyone and see who is interested in what, and do a quick survey? Start a discussion. So we're hoping to be able to start providing more assistance. And I know, Phil, we can't clone you all over the state. And another thing we wanted to talk about was how we can train up and gain experience in our area to be able to, do this kind of thing.
If there was a project that had CEQA purview, overview, umbrella, and you were an adjacent landowner, is it feasible to extend that project to include another pertinent piece of property that's key to the defensible space of this critical
I would say it's possible.
Has it been done?
So my basic answer to that is it is a nuanced answer, and I think that's what Chief Watson is kind of getting at, is it's possible. My basic answer is anytime you have an opportunity to go bigger and get more landowners involved, that's generally better, because what we're trying to do in the prescribed fire world is not only reintroduce fire, but we're also trying to reintroduce it in a way that mimics, as best as we can, historic fire regimes. So historically, fire did not burn to somebody's fence line and go out, right? It just continued to burn until it got to a ridge line or waterway or whatever. And so that's what we're trying to do with prescribed fire. The bigger we can make our footprint, generally the better. Now, there are some caveats to that, of course, is at some point you can only, you can't burn 100,000 acres, that'd be awesome, but there's some logistical challenges to that. It gets more people involved and so on and so forth. But I guess my answer to your question is, if you've got a neighbor that will sign on, let's say with a VMP, then both of your land can then be evaluated under the CEQA process.
All right, I'll make some calls.
Yeah.
Okay, and then whoever's interested, we should stay in touch.
And I'm sorry, Heather, did you have a question in your comment a minute ago, or?
Well, I know we're over time, and I usually will stick with staying on time, respecting people's schedules. So I did want to find out, and maybe we can talk about it later, how we can, and I can communicate that through the numbers, what's our next steps for starting to work towards getting more done here in our area.
Absolutely.
But I know you've got a training program that you
Right, so another thing that I do in my company is I teach classes. And most of my students are fire agency folks who are looking for a specific class to achieve a specific qualification. However, I've also taught to non-agency folks. So some of you might know Jared Childress with the Audubon Canyon Ranch. I actually taught a 2-day basic firefighter academy, if you want to call it that, at an ACR property in near Stinson Beach a couple months ago. And it's super basic. It's not like going to the Cal Fire Academy, but it teaches you the basic things that someone would need to know to at least be on a prescribed fire and be safe. So things like how to dig line, how to do a progressive hose lay, how to do mobile attack, how to deploy your shelter if you're going to wear a shelter, a fire shelter, things of that nature. So yeah, that's certainly something else that I do as well.
Any more questions through Phil? Giving us our time.
I want to say thank you all for being here. I know it's getting a little warm in here, so.
Thank you very much.
Have any questions, I'll be here. I'm not in a big hurry to leave. I also have business cards if you're interested.